So it's my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker. Mr. Mike Stolte is the Executive Director of the Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurial Leadership. He is the originator and co-creator of the Business Vitality Initiative, the Community Vitality Initiative, the Community Matrix, the Community Checkup, and the Green Light Checkup, all tools and processes to assess and strengthen communities. Mike has spent many years working in the field of community, economic, business, and entrepreneurial development. He has facilitated several national conferences and think tanks and has written many articles and publications in the field, including Beyond Economic Survival, 97 Ways Small Communities Can Thrive, a guide to community vitality. Over the past few years, Mike has made presentations in Australia, the United States, New Zealand, and in many parts of Canada. His subject matter most often centers around the need and the method for creating entrepreneurial, vital, and sustainable communities. His work has been featured in the Globe and Mail's Report on Business, Canadian Living and Profit magazines, and CBC Radio Sounds Like Canada, and on the Australia Broadcasting Corporation. So you can see he's got both left and right of center media covered there. So, past president of the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation, Mike also serves on the advisory committee of the Canadian Rural Research Network and is a past member of the Cooperative Development Initiative of Canada. He holds degrees from Carleton University, which is an MA in Public Administration, and the University of Western Ontario in Economics. Please join with me in welcoming Mr. Stolte to the podium tonight. We look forward to what you have to say.
Thanks. I'll try and give you updates as this progresses on the debate. I believe the score was 3-1 at the end of the first. And I know I'm in Alberta, but I must put this on. I don't know if you can see that, but I've spent too many years seeing the Oilers and the Flames crush my team. Years ago, I was a Leafs fan. I grew up in Northern Ontario. And about 20 years, I moved to BC, and I thought I was a Leafs fan, and the Leafs were playing the Canucks in the playoffs. And the Leafs scored in overtime to beat the Canucks. And I stood up and swore. And I realized at that time I was cured. I was no longer a Leafs fan. That's this. So I want to thank you for coming tonight. I want you to look at this photo behind me and think of what you see. Does anybody recognize it? It's Robert Hornbrook's neighborhood? No, that's not it. It's Baker Street in Nelson. How many of you have been to Nelson, BC? Okay, that's the town I live in right now. That was about 100 years ago, or probably less than 100 years ago. At that time, the town was peaking. They extracted more silver from Nelson in those years, and the Kootenays, they extracted 3 times the value in silver than they did in gold in all of the California gold rush. But the town in about 1910 hit a snag. The silver mines kind of dried up. They had to change the way that they did business and drove their economy. They more or less looked at agriculture as their savior until about 1930, when a blight, a pest, killed all the orchards in the area. And then they switched to forestry. And forestry served the community and our part of British Columbia for a long time, probably up until the 1980s, when the three major employers in my town shut down. The mill, which was called Kootenay Forest Products, shut down, largest employer in our town. The university had the bad fortune of having its funding withdrawn by the province. They picked the wrong political party. You've all probably know people or organizations that have done that. They've got the bad fortune of being the only university ever to have its public funding withdrawn within Canada. And the CP Diesel Repair Yard, which had been another major employer, shut down. The town was reeling. Now, the community recovered somewhat. It took a number of years, but the reality is it's become a different town. One of its exports is education. One of its exports is entrepreneurs. It's got a high quality of life, which tends to attract people that are really committed to the community and much more entrepreneurial. I want to draw your attention to the quote, "Those who have finished learning find themselves equipped to live in a world that no longer exists." And I think one of the points I'd like to make tonight when I talk about community readiness and community vitality is you can have it all, but it'll change. The world is consistently changing. The rate of change is increasing. And we continually have to equip ourselves with the tools, the love of learning, the knowledge. And I think most of you here are educators. I think it's probably partly our responsibility to create that culture so that that ongoing learning can exist. So tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about community readiness, community vitality, share with you some tools and resources, and we'll follow it up with a question and answer period. And again, quote, "The next century will be accompanied by 20,000 years of technological progress compared to today's rate of change." And that's a well-known author named Ray Kurzweil, The Age of Spiritual Machines. Think about that. 20,000 years of progress over the next small amount of time. We've just started seeing change. I look at the way my kids communicate now. Even Facebook is passé to them. I'm just getting an account and learning what it's like, and they're basically using new forms of media. And that will continue to change, and change with increasing rapidity. A little bit about my organization, CL. CL, as some of you know, means sky in French, and I just learned it means goal in Slovakian. I'm an urban refugee. I moved from Vancouver 20 years ago to Nelson, and I landed, or 16 years ago to Nelson, and I landed in an organization that you're probably all familiar with if you live in a rural community. I ended up working with Community Futures of Central Kootenay. And I was the business analyst there for a number of years, and then I wanted to more or less learn how to work with the communities. I found that it was much more rewarding for me to work with communities. But what we found was that many of the communities in our region, we've got 20% of the communities in BC, but only 3% of the population, many of them were stuck. We call them constipated communities. They had seen better days. Sorry for those of you that are eating. I apologize for that. Somebody almost choked over here. What we found was that these constipated communities were waiting for somebody to come in and shake them up. They didn't feel like they had the energy to do it themselves. And what we realized was that looking at different processes, that it was really important that the energy came from within a community. Oftentimes a consultant will come in and tell a community what's good for it. If there's no passion, there's no energy in the community, it can't be created. So we created a process, which I'll talk about just briefly, called the Business Vitality Index or Initiative. And it allowed a community to more or less measure its business friendliness as a way to get an accurate assessment of where it is or where it was as a starting point. The first part is to assess. The second part is to get the community focused so a 70-page report doesn't overwhelm it. And the third point is to make sure that there's action at the end of it. And there was a huge gap in Canada in rural communities. People were doing assessments. They were sitting on shelves. Probably you've seen shelves full of $10,000, $20,000 reports. There had to be a better way. So we created this tool, not recognizing that a whole organization will be created around this. Since then, we've expanded to doing training and other forms of technical assistance. We became independent in 2005. Within Community Futures, my boss got mad because I was doing more of my work outside the region and became an independent organization in 2005. And as Jason mentioned in the introduction, we've been really honored that our work has been recognized in other jurisdictions. So I mentioned the BVI, and one of the ways that we try and measure where a community is by using perceptions. And I'll give you a website address where you can get most of what I'll be talking about tonight. But if you look at this graph, this spider graph or this blob, essentially the bigger the blob, the better your community thinks it's doing. And the perceptions are really important because they measure those things that people think are going on in the community. Sometimes they're wrong. Sometimes they're way off. But it's a way to get a reading as a starting point, as a benchmark, so that communities can sort of say, oh, collectively we feel this. We're not that good. Compared to all the other communities that CL has worked with, we're not doing so badly. For instance, succession is something that most communities beat themselves up over. Or NGOs, community colleges, councils don't often have succession plans, but rarely do many have succession plans. So with the BVI, the Business Vitality Tool, I'm not going to talk too much about it tonight, but we found a way of allowing communities to measure themselves as a reference point to compare themselves with other communities, as a starting point, focus on 3 short-term outcomes, basically move beyond constipated to acting. I described myself to my 12-year-old son at one point as, he said, Dad, what do you really do? You're an economist. And I said, well, I'm like the Bran. I kind of get communities moving. And he understood that metaphor. So I'm going to be talking about the other 2 tools in a few minutes. I won't talk too much about them. But the Communities Matrix is a way of gauging readiness. And I think it's a good starting point for starting the conversation in communities. The Community Vitality Initiative, Business Vitality was narrow. Community Vitality is broader. Sustainability is even broader than that. I'll talk about that. And we've done other economic development training and other resources. A few years ago, we were contracted by the federal government to build a leadership program for rural communities in Canada. And we put together something called Leading Communities BC. And what was different about it, we modeled it after a really successful program in Oregon. And in that's the Ford Family Foundation Rural Development Initiative. What they tried to do is take a cross-section of the community. So it wasn't just established leaders. It was anyone from a 13-year-old who didn't really consider himself to have any leadership potential up to an 85-year-old retiree. 25 to 30 people would go through a 4-weekend program, learn a curriculum of things like conflict resolution, community systems, how to collaborate, how to think like an entrepreneur, as a way of collectively building the capacity of the community. When we developed this, as you can see by this little graphic here, we focused on the leader within as a central starting point. A lot of leadership programs do. We also tried to put a few other things that are really critical to building strong communities. One of them was something around understanding community systems, as well as collaborative leadership. That's kind of where leadership is going, and transformational leadership. And that's ensuring that people have the entrepreneurial wherewithal to make sure that they can make those changes that are needed in communities. One of the things that we did when we developed it, we put out an expression of interest, thinking that maybe half dozen communities in BC would respond. We ended up with 42 formal applications, 85 inquiries. A number of those were First Nation, non-First Nation partnerships that had never worked together as communities, which was very heartening. We only had the funding to carry out 3. The number one reason people applied to be part of this leadership program pilot, it wasn't so much to learn the leadership skills. It was to deal with the dramatic changes that were going on in the community, and to learn how to collaborate. You'd think that people know or learn how to play in the sandbox together when they're in kindergarten, but the reality is that we're all struggling with it within our communities, within our regions, from organization to organization, and that was seen as a key thing. For those of you that are really interested in sort of tools or resources, this is on our website. Jason mentioned it. It's called Beyond Economic Survival, 97 Ways Small Communities Can Thrive, a guide to community vitality. It's kind of a summary of community vitality that I'll be talking about tonight, so you can download that. That's a free publication. And we just finished a community economic development guide for the BC government you can download as well, called Starting Strong. It's designed for communities under 10,000, trying to figure out where to start within community and or economic development. And that was sponsored by the BC Rural Secretariat. The other thing that we're just working on right now is finishing up a tourism tool called Tourism 360, and it more or less tries to assess where the community is. Someone's smiling at the beer guys. I can see that. Are your businesses smiling? What it tries to do is assess where the community thinks it is, the community's resources are in terms of tourism, matched with kind of an expert appraisal of tourism resources, putting it together like a 360, like a leadership 360. And again, we're putting together a free guide, and as well, we're trying to train people to use it as opposed to having to go out to communities and run with it. So now to get into the meat of this. So tools. How many people in this room like tools? Okay, about a third. How many consider themselves to be tools? About a third, okay. Fair enough. All right, as I mentioned, we encountered many communities in our region that were constipated. They considered themselves stuck. Plan had become a four-letter word. Strategic planning was the only tool in their toolbox. So whatever the situation, the government, provincial or federal, would say, oh, you got to do a strategic plan. Well, the reality is some of these communities were so stuck that, and so the conflict was so entrenched that they were actually throwing chairs at one another within community meetings and bringing concealed firearms. Now, I don't know if there are any meetings like that here. I know there's some hockey teams where people go to war, but that's probably not a good foundation in which to build a strong community. As I mentioned, if you mention the word plan in some communities, they would roll their eyes and groan. A graduate student had come in and drawn up a plan. We wanted to make sure that at the end of the day, a plan was drawn up where there was action at the end of the day. So again, we needed to reestablish trust, build some respect, and some small successes. And what we realized is that the starting place in many of this was around making sure that communities were seen as entrepreneurial or business friendly. That was kind of the evolution, how we kind of got started. We came up with something called the Communities Matrix. There should be a copy in front of each of you, and I'm going to refer to it in a moment. After having worked with about 15 or 20 communities around BC and in other places, we put together a grid. And the grid looks something like this. There is a grid version of this circle. But what it did is it took out characteristics of the communities and it put them into something that we could understand. So before we went out and worked with a community, we'd sort of say, is this community ready to work with us? If it is, where are they ready to work with us? What kind of tool or process? Before long, it kind of got circulated, and it had the names of the community. So that chair-throwing community, the first versions of it had the name of the community, and it started getting circulated. And before I knew it, I got called down to Victoria for a meeting, and people were using it in Oregon and other places as a way of deciding whether some communities should be part of some programs. This was just our own invention. We had based it upon our own interpretations of having worked with communities. So we realized that there was some demand for this. We ended up putting together a really great team. We got some funding from Indian Northern Affairs, Western Economic Diversification, and the Canadian Rural Partnership. Put together a crackerjack team and a really good steering committee and did a proper literature review. We also talked to 15 top community development practitioners across Canada, and we turned it into the product that you see in front of you. It's kind of a one-page conceptual framework, which I'll be talking about in a moment. So, as I said, it becomes a very quick way of assessing where you are in terms of a starting point for community development. As I often say, it's a conversation starter. So, in BC and the Yukon, First Nations are required to use the matrix prior to engaging in comprehensive community planning. So you can sort of see the first version of it was kind of based on this more of a triangle or a grid. This version of it in front of you is based on a circle. Now, how many of you have seen the matrix before? Again, about a third. We've got 2/3 of the people that can't lift their arm or haven't seen it before. Good. So I'll quickly explain it to you. And then depending upon the time, I might actually get you to stand up. All right. So the yellow, start at the top, start at noon at the top. If you can't follow along on the PowerPoint, please refer to the one in front of you. Essentially, we get communities that were in the yellow that are in real chaos. And essentially, conflict is so deeply rooted within these communities, it's very difficult to work. You need to almost bring in a conflict resolution expert. You may not call it conflict resolution, but you want to make sure that you're doing some things that kind of get them beyond this area. So I often say that in this particular one, if you have a community meeting, you often have to bring a police person or a policeman. Now, when you shift to the right, as you go around, you pick up capacity or resiliency. It's basically like building your muscles as a community into the red area. And you might not think of it as being good, but you move to a stage or a phase that's called non-cooperation, paralysis, or just a little bit unfocused. Or you're just coping with day-to-day matters. And I've run into an awful lot of communities where this is the case. Hopefully, you can move beyond that as a community. When we created our first tool, without knowing this, we were aiming for these communities in this red area. What you need in that particular case is probably a small project, apolitical, to reestablish trust and respect, to get momentum going. So it could be downtown cleanup, it could be banners. There's no project that's completely non-political or apolitical, but you get my drift. You don't want to choose the biggest thing, the biggest project out there. As you move further around the circle towards the blue, you get into being able to do some simple planning, some strategic thinking, some strategic planning, and hopefully some visioning. And we hope all communities are here. When I started working with communities years ago, I assumed everyone was at least here. But what I realized, I've done in rooms of up to 300 people, most people aren't where you think they are. The thinking is that the community down the road is in better shape than you are. It's kind of like the family thing. It's like we're kind of dysfunctional, but every other family is somewhat dysfunctional as well. And then if you keep going, as you keep going over to the white area, you start to integrate, which means that the business, education, NGOs in the community are working together. They're kind of working harmoniously or riffing off one another. You get to an innovation stage where people are often thinking of possibility and opportunity. It's permeating the whole community. And finally, you get to a learning stage where there's a learning culture. You're sharing things with other communities. It becomes a core value of your community. And one would hope that everyone could get here. Now, I'm going to ask you to think about the community that you're presently located in. If you don't live in a community or you don't really know it that well, maybe think of an organization you're familiar with or even a community that you're familiar with. I'd like you to stand up right now. I got a little bit of time, so if this is okay, Judy, I'll just get people to stand up, and I'm going to divide the room into 4 quadrants. All right, if everyone could stand up. And hopefully everyone can, we got the squeaky chair going off. So I'd like you to, as I said, I'm dividing the room into the 4 quadrants. So for those of you that think that your community is in the yellow stage or phase, if you could move to this part of the room, so kind of aligned with the way that the grid is, or the circle is up here. If you think you're in the red area, could you move kind of to the back over there? If you believe your community is in the blue, if you could move to just over here. And if you think your community is in the white, if you could just move to kind of where this projector is up here. If you could just do that very quietly and quickly without... All right. Typically we have, are there any politicians in the room? Typically we have them standing in the middle. All right. You can see there's quite a diversity in terms of where people believe they are in the community, which is in their particular communities, which is great. We've got probably 5% over here. I'm guessing, I'm ballparking it maybe 30% in the red area, 50% over here in the blue area, which is great, and we've got about a dozen delusionals. No, that's great. We've got a number of people that are in communities that are doing quite well, which is great. All right. Now, one of the metaphors that I often use when I'm using the matrix is I talk about applying this as an individual. And so I talk about the sort of the couch potato. Let's say you're a couch potato, because what you're trying to do is build the organizational capacity and resiliency. So you're building the muscles of your community. So if you're the couch potato, sort of the metaphor, sitting on the couch, you might see yourself as being in the yellow area, right? And then you watch the Olympics. You watch the Vancouver Olympics, and you're inspired. You say, boy, you know what? I'm going to go out tomorrow, and I'm going to be able to walk around the block by the end of the week. So you become much more functional. You start to exercise your muscles, and within a very short period of time, you're in that red area. You can do some stuff. And you sort of say, that wasn't so bad. I'm going to continue to exercise, change my diet. I'm going to run 5 kilometers. And so you move into that blue area where you've now got these muscles, you're really a functioning kind of individual. And then you say, you know what, that wasn't so bad. Next year I'm going to run a marathon. So you run your marathon, you do your training, you have a good diet, you're inspired by people. What happens when you run that marathon? So you've moved into that white area, you're kind of an elite community or individual. What happens after you run that marathon? And you basically say, well, you know what, that was fun, but I'm going to go sit on the couch again and eat. More than likely, you're going to start drifting back down here, right back, almost over to yellow. And I think the default state of most communities is yellow, unless there are people in the community kind of making it different. And it's really important to sort of allow your particular community to have a conversation about where it is. Now, one of the reasons that we made it circular in this version is that oftentimes a natural disaster, the moving away of certain people, even a community becomes so successful, it becomes so desirable that everyone wants to move there. And as a result of everyone moving there, it displaces a lot of the young people in the community that make it dynamic. It becomes so expensive that it loses its resiliency, its capacity, and its vigor. And you can sort of hit a tipping point and go right over into that yellow. There's actually people that have written books, or there's a field of community psychology that talks about a maintenance phase. Once you kind of get to do your strategic plan, you've done great things. Unless you maintain it, you lose that muscle mass as a community, and you start to slide backwards. And I've been in a lot of communities where people go, oh, we did that 3 years ago. Why do we have to do it again? The reality is because you're going to drift backwards. Now, I want you all very quickly to move to where you think your community was 3 years ago. Okay? So move to where you believe your community was 3 years ago. So a lot of people move backwards, which is good because that means that their communities have progressed in the last 3 years. And I saw one of my friends, Leslie, moving in the other direction, so that's probably not a good thing. Typically, this is a great conversation starting tool because you can use it in a very simple manner like this. It doesn't require a lot of training to start a dialogue in your community. Oftentimes I'll pick on people and say, why do you think you've moved in that direction? What's happened? What are some of the key events? Rather than sort of saying, it sucks, or my community sucks, it gives you another language to talk about or to even strive for. I was doing some work in Kimberley in BC, and somebody came up to me. Before we do the business vitality or community vitality process, we lay this in front of a number of the city leaders, community leaders, not necessarily the elected leaders, but sort of a representative group, and sort of say, where do you think you are on the matrix? And pretty much everyone was aligned. They were kind of in the reddish blue area, and probably a little bit further up the blue. And we sort of said, okay, we can probably do this process with you because you're in that zone where this tool is made for you. And while I was doing the tool or doing the business vitality process, about a month later, somebody came up to me and they said, that exercise with the matrix was very valuable because he said, we think we're spinning our wheels, yet we've realized that we were kind of in that non-cooperation stage, and now we can do some simple and strategic planning, but we've had no language to speak about it. So to me, what it meant was that there's people can relate to it, which is great, and if you can use it in your own communities or even within organizations. Selkirk College in BC, I just did a planning session with them, and we use this as an organizational tool because they see their organization as a small community, and they were able to have a fairly good conversation about their community. If everyone could just sit down now, that's great. Thanks. I realized I was working with one community, and the chief administrative officer said to me, he goes, "This is great." He goes, "I'm going to use it at council. Even the mayor can understand this." And I didn't know if that was good or bad. But one of the things that they were able to do, they were able to sort of say, well, the business community is here, the arts community is here, social services community is here, and they were able to kind of more accurately describe where different communities were. And again, it can be a useful tool in terms of starting conversation. You can download it from our website. We've got the grid version and the circular version. If you don't like it, pass it on to somebody that likes conceptual frameworks or systems. And as I pointed out, we've got another publication that you can download from our website as well. It's called 69 Tools, Techniques, and Resources for Communities. And depending upon where you are, there are different tools that are more appropriate. Most of the tools are in the public domain that are listed here. And again, you know, if you're in that yellow area where you're throwing chairs at one another, I know the ARDN board. I've heard their meetings are really rough, and you might want to pick the tool that's most appropriate. Where's Rick? He's left with his bodyguards. All right. And then the way that we generate our revenue is through our fee-based systems, where we take it a little bit deeper. We do a community survey, and we more or less ask. It's kind of like this on steroids. We have 7 different categories, and we kind of administer that, and it gives a community a much better. It's kind of like a targeted SWOT assessment. It gives a community a much better sense of where it is prior to starting. So we just did one with Quatsino First Nation on Vancouver Island. They were going into comprehensive community planning, and they wanted to kind of know what all the good and bad stuff that was happening in the community. We do some qualitative, it's all qualitative, but we also ask some other key questions. And interestingly enough, we found that we've had requests for the matrix from, I think, about 17 different countries now. So something we developed in the Kootenays really resonates outside the area as well, which is really heartening for us. So community vitality. I want you to close your eyes just for a second and just think of what community vitality means to you. Like, what's the image that comes up? It can be a smell, it can be a sound, it can be a visual image. Just close your eyes. These lights are loud. All right, anybody want to volunteer what they came up with? The cash register sound. Okay. Families on pathways, kind of biking and enjoying the community. Okay, great. Yep. Clean, everything painted, looking good. No poverty. Okay? Okay, great. Any other images that were really strong or indelible in your minds? Yep. Sorry, this is a big auditorium. A lot of people? A lot of people in the community sort of coming together, doing things? Okay. Okay. Anyone else want to share? Anyone got a really strong voice that can project?
Check.
Okay. Okay, a caring community where you see people looking after one another. Okay. I'm just about finished. We'll do that with the Q&A, but okay, great. Now, when I think of a vital community, the image that comes to mind is kids riding around on bikes, kind of carefree, of course wearing helmets, but kids riding around wearing bikes, not worrying about anything, kind of except getting home for dinner, just having fun and laughing. That's the image that always comes to my head. Now, there are different ways of defining community vitality, and about 4 years ago, we were contracted by, in Quebec, to build a community vitality index. They liked the work we had done on business vitality, and they said, can you build something similar, broader, around community vitality? So we, again, put together a research team. We had a really strong board of advisors. We had Ray Bowman from Stats Canada. We had Mark Anielski, who's an Edmonton guy. We had some really great people. And we looked at 60 different studies from around the world on resiliency, on quality of life, on community capacity, on all manner. Many of them were written at the large community level. There's some really good ones from Seattle and Portland and Vancouver, but a lot of them weren't translated for smaller communities. So what we tried to do is take them down to a level that could be understood. What we tried to do as well is take some statistical indicators where possible and also combine it with perceptual. So again, what are the perceptions in the community? And this definition is probably the most universally accepted. Communities that are vital are those that are economically profitable, ecologically sustainable, and socially desirable. It's probably no surprise. They call that the three-legged stool. But communities that are a little out of whack in those particular areas can sometimes run into real problems. Now, what we did when we put together our Community Vitality Index and a lot of our research, we came up with 9 categories. We couldn't reduce it beyond that. And those categories were personal and economic security. So each of these has 8 to 10 indicators. And if you want the full list of indicators, you can download that publication, Beyond Economic Survival, 97 Ways Small Communities Can Thrive. If you're wondering why we don't have 100, it's because we had 100, but it was for Quebec, and 3 of them related to language, so we took them out. They weren't universal. So personal and economic security. Can middle-income earners afford a place in the community? Do women feel safe to walk downtown at night? Things like that. A learning culture. Do the business and education communities cooperate to provide timely, useful learning? Are people interested in learning beyond sort of the typical fare that's offered at a community college or a university? Is there kind of a learning culture? One of the communities we worked in had the best educational infrastructure, but the lowest score on that particular question. There just was a disconnect. It wasn't access, it was just sort of that culture of learning. It just wasn't present in the community. A culture of wellness. Do you see healthy-looking seniors in the community? Is there good food in the schools that our youth go to and is actually being eaten? Leadership. Now, leadership's an overused term, but there are a number of really critical issues around leadership. There will always be divisive issues in communities, but is there a forum where divisive issues can be discussed in a civil manner? Do new people in the community, do they have opportunities to become leaders in the community? And that's a really important one because, well, I visited a number of communities that I was considering moving to, and you had to be 3rd, 4th, 5th generation there in order to get on the board of the chamber or another important community organization. A clean environment, clean air, clean water, a number of other things, good public transportation, vibrant arts, heritage, and culture. Now, I grew up in Sudbury, which is a hockey town, real sport town, kind of like Trail, BC, and I always thought that sports was really important, but there's really compelling evidence to suggest that This is as much or more important, making sure there are places, venues in the community where all ages can see performances. Oftentimes it's just the bar. Is the town aware of and does it promote its local history? Things of that nature. A sense of community and connectedness. Do you feel like you belong in the community? Are newcomers welcome in the community? It's one of those things that's very intangible, very hard to measure or read, but this is one of the ways we take kind of a measurement of it. Community entrepreneurship and innovation. Does the community recognize opportunities, and is it able to kind of translate those into opportunities into something? You know, when you've been away on a trip and you come back and you go, man, that would be so great here. And then after a week or so, you kind of forget about that. You see your community with your old eyes. And it's also creating an environment or a mindset so that, or a fertile ground so that entrepreneurs, small businesses can flourish in the community. If you plant a field and you don't tend to it with fertilizer, with watering, with protection, it's unlikely to survive. If you do the same with small businesses and entrepreneurs, and you don't kind of incubate them, they're unlikely to survive either. Physical space. Now that's the type of thing, are there places where you can run into people, not run in and hurt them, but basically run into people where you can go, you're out for a walk, there are parks, there are sidewalks, there are places to play chess, places to have a conversation. In reality, communities are places where connections are made, and it's really important to provide as many places where people can connect outside of a car as possible. It's also things like municipal buildings or public buildings. Are they cared for? Are there gardens outside? Do people care for their homes? Are they proud of them? Things of that nature. So the CVI is Community Vitality Initiative, and this is Vulcan. Anybody here from Vulcan? Okay, great. There is somebody here from Vulcan. This was a BVI process, and I should point out the BVI, we've had a great partnership with Alberta Rural Development and lately with the AUMA, the Alberta Urban Municipalities Association, in delivering them. Tomorrow night we're in Rocky Mountain House, and the next night we're in Olds. But CVI basically allows a community to measure itself relative to other communities, not sort of Coronation versus Castor. I know there have been some good hockey games over a number of years between those two communities, rival communities. But in terms of measuring it relative to a large group of other similar communities. And it uses those perceptions as a way to get the community to a common understanding of itself, to get it focused on a few short-term outcomes, and to get it kind of moving along. We want to move every community to that blue area from the red or from the yellow, and hopefully to that white area as well. Just to show you kind of, this is one of the ways that we measure. You can see here, citizens are motivated to learn new skills and develop existing ones. Businesses and educational institutions collaborate to train for employment skills needed by the community, things of that nature. We kind of ask people to strongly agree or disagree. And this is, I showed you that other radial graph, the spider graph before. This is a more traditional way. This is Wakefield, Quebec, and you can kind of see this is the way we show how the community scored out of 100, and we also show it relative to other communities. But Wakefield, Quebec was one of our pilot communities. The sense of community came out on top. Community entrepreneurship and innovation came out on the bottom. If any of you are familiar with Wakefield, very dynamic arts community, but again, they had some, every community obviously has issues. This is just a way that the kind of the tools blend together. Communities Matrix starts with a simple conversation. The other tool that I mentioned, Community Checkup, kind of goes to another level, and the Business Vitality, Community Vitality kind of go in a little bit more depth. Now, you can take our manual, you can apply a number of them to your own community. You could come up with 1,000 different measures of community vitality. And one of the things I often say is that we've come up with our own, but many communities have distinct personalities, and some of them you should really customize what sort of a community vitality process for your own community. And because every community is a little bit different, what one community values, another community might not. So I'm gonna conclude just by asking you. You've got a copy of it hopefully on your desk, but I'm going to ask you questions, and I want you to respond if you think your community is doing well in this regard, right? Okay, how many of you would strongly agree local middle income earners can afford to buy a home in your community? How many people would agree with that? Okay, about a third. How many people would disagree? About a third, okay? Really different. Women consider it safe to walk alone downtown at night. How many people would agree? Good to see it wasn't just the men saying that. Okay. How many people would disagree? Okay. So I think it was more people agreed, a third, and about 20% maybe disagreed. We have at least one public festival that generates a feeling of magic and excitement. How many people would agree with that? Wow, that's impressive. That's like 60 or 70%. How many people would disagree with that? Okay. Just a few people at the back. Okay, that's good. Citizens are motivated to learn new skills and develop existing ones. How many people would agree? This side of the room, much more agreement. I would say 40, 50%. How many people would disagree with that? I'd say maybe 20 or 30%. Oh, this is my home in Nelson, by the way. This was yesterday when I left. No, it was actually all our snow is melted now, so just the last week. Although we did get a squall yesterday. You see many active, healthy-looking seniors in your community. How many people would agree with that? Okay, good. That's about 2/3. How many people would disagree with that? About 20%. This town believes in itself, our community. We think that with enough support, we can do anything. How many of you have that can-do attitude in your community? Okay, I want to move to the communities over here. They seem really good. Okay, I would say it was about a third. How many people would disagree with that? Can't-do attitude. It was kind of like that half-hearted hand up. Okay, and that was about 20%. For newcomers to the community and those who wish to, there are meaningful opportunities to get involved and make a difference in the community. How many of you would agree with that? Lots of opportunities, openness. Okay, good, more than half. How many people would disagree? You've got kind of a closed community. A few at the back, okay, maybe 10%. Groups with similar interests form alliances and cooperate to achieve goals. Okay, a little less than half. How many people would disagree with that? Okay, I don't see a hand up there, which is, oh, no, there is a hand at the back. Is it the local college or the university? Young adults consider the community a desirable place to live. That's 25 to 34-year-olds. Okay, about 40%. How many would disagree with that? I would say that's about 40%. Now, that's a really important question. It's often a question I talk about. Demographically, 15 to 19-year-olds are pretty much footloose and fancy-free. They don't tend to stick around. They don't plant roots. 20 to 24-year-olds statistically still don't settle down. It's the 25 to 34-year-old that will plant roots, buy real estate, buy a business or start a business, and replenish the leadership in the community. And oftentimes in communities, that's a really important demographic to think about. So some communities will score. We have another question on both our CVI and our BVI. It asks, do you think this community is a desirable place to live? And sometimes the community will score 80%, but on this young people question, they'll score 20 or 30 as a score. And they realize that, it's great for me. It's got a curling club. It's got good hunting, good fishing. But for young people, it doesn't hold a lot. It might have slow internet. It may not have a lot of opportunities. Recognizing that there is a time where people want to get back to a slower life. You're not going to get everyone back, but it's the 25 to 34-year-old age group. Citizens greet people on the street regardless of whether they know them. How many people would agree with that? Okay, there's some friendly communities over here. I've got to get to know you people. Okay, Either that or they had more wine. That's okay. How many people would disagree with that? Okay, about 10%. Innovation is valued and recognized in the community. How many people would agree with that? Okay. Okay, and I would think that colleges and universities, that's kind of a part of their culture, trying to make an innovative culture. How many people would disagree? Okay, again, maybe 15%. There are friendly public spaces where a variety of kinds of people feel welcome. Parks, squares, fountains, outdoor cafes, benches, playgrounds. How many people would agree with that? Okay. How many people would disagree? Okay, so that was about 40% to about 20%. 40% agreed. So even if you just look at those 12 and you take that back to your community, and I'll post that on the website in the next couple days, you can download it, just give it to some people to start a conversation. There are 12 ways that you can improve your community, or at least get the conversation going in the community. I was presenting at a conference in Nova Scotia in Cape Breton, and there was an 80-something-year-old woman sitting at my table, and she said something to me that was really profound. She said something about a conversation. She said, you need a conversation to start a community. And I said, what? Pardon? And she said, if you can't have a conversation in your community, you can't really have a community. And that really struck me. One of the things that we've tried to do in the last year or two in Nelson, my town, is we had a series of conversation cafes. And essentially they were just open form. We tried to have 3 presenters on 5 different topics related to community vitality. So one of them was on business vitality. One of them was the value of arts, culture, and heritage in the community. One of them was on sustainability. One of them was on something else. We had no idea if anyone would show up. But we had 3 speakers that sort of spoke for 5 or 10 minutes, and we had somebody facilitating. At each of those, we had a packed coffee house. We had 90 to 100 people. We ended up, having to shut the doors. People were really hungry to have that conversation. There were no outcomes attached to it. We weren't trying to do anything other than kind of start the conversation. And we just felt it was really important to introduce people to these concepts and to ensure that, and we called it the 100-mile ideas diet. So the experts came from within 100 miles of the community rather than getting someone else from away. And we found that was really important. We ended up turning them into a series of podcasts and put them on the radio. I had an intern that had her own radio show, and she did, I think, 14 radio shows that basically not only the guest speakers, but she also got into the dialogue as the microphone was being passed around the cafe. Just a really simple thing, and I really think that so much of building a community is creating forums and venues to have these conversations. We don't live in a place like Rwanda. We don't live in a place like Serbia or Kosovo in their worst times. We live in places that we can afford to have these conversations. And it's really important to have them, as I was speaking to, I think, Trent before this, before you get the really divisive issues happening in the community, at which time you get the chair throwing, or you get hopefully not, the people bringing firearms in. And I think it's really important for us, in some capacity, to help to generate these types of conversations. So I just wanted to reiterate, we do have some free resources, and I will provide the ARDN with a copy of my PowerPoint, which will be posted. But if you're interested in community vitality, the one that I mentioned was Beyond Economic Survival, a guide to community vitality, 97 ways small communities can thrive. We've also got 10 principles of a vital community. That was did that for Canadian Living. And then the mini CVI, which you've got a copy of. On tools and readiness, we've got that publication, 69 Tools, Techniques, and Resources for Communities. And we've also got the community matrix, the 2 versions, the circle or the grid, if you find that useful. And in terms of broader sort of business or community and economic development, we've got tons of stuff, but we do have that Starting Strong guide we did for the BC government, and also a business checkup, which is kind of like the mini CVI, but it also kind of asks a number of questions around the business health of your community. And what we try and do is we can go in and assess your community, or we can train you to do a more comprehensive version of the tools as well. I just want to close with a few quotes. The old style of throwing money at the problem in rural Australia isn't the answer. The task of rejuvenating a region and the choice of $50 million or $2 million and 20 committed local leaders, we would choose the small amount of money and the committed leaders. And that was a McKinsey & Company, which is one of the world's largest consultancies, did this huge review in Australia. And the point was that it's not the money, it's really the passion and the commitment of leadership within the community. And I would say that's probably equally as important in Canada. These are my children, whose names I don't remember. I'm not home alone. The future of every community lies in capturing the passion, the imagination, and the resources of its people. I think that quote is really powerful. It's not somebody coming in from the outside. It's your own energy within your community. And recognizing that change is the law of life. John F. Kennedy said that, and those who look only to the past or the present are certain to miss the future. And I think the point there is to recognize that things will change, and if we're learners and if we're bringers of learning to the community, we should be helping to equip others in the community with the tools so that they can adapt to the change. And the final quote on this page is, "A leader is a dealer in hope." So fairly dubious source here, Napoleon Bonaparte, but I really do like the quote, that we all have a responsibility to not necessarily look at the worst side of things. I think I'm trained as an economist, and I can go into a room and basically by the end of a conversation have people ready to slit their wrists. But I recognize that my role is to get people excited about the possibilities and to get them to think that they can do it. And often they can. That's the reality of it. And I want to close with the quote I always use: "We are the leaders we have been waiting for," and recognizing that it's not someone else coming in from somewhere else. It's us, the people that walk through the community every day. It's not some great leader that will be elected, whether we're a minor baseball coach or a paramedic who volunteers or the president of the local college. We all have a role to play, and the smaller the community, often the larger the role. And we're all somewhat influential. And I think it's really important to recognize that and to inspire your communities to try to do more.